So it is that time of year again when we finally get to kind of wrap things up from 2015. We get to talk about my worst and best movies of the year. And we'll start with the worst because it's just more fun to talk about the best, so I'll save the more fun stuff for later. But yeah, so 5 worst movies of 2015. And my usual disclaimers, this is a list of 5 instead of the usual 10 because usually if I hear a movie's bad, I'm not going to, spend money to go out and see it because I am kind of living on a student's budget. But also because I do a top 15 list for my best, so I just kind of like to balance it out. And take note that this list will contain one Filipino movie and a couple of straight-to-DVD releases. But please stick around when you see those movies come up. Don't just skip forward because I do think there are interesting things about these movies that make them bad that's kind of still worth noting. And I will use this opportunity to talk about the deeper problems that these movies point to. And I feel like I have to make this disclaimer because I feel like a lot of people are expecting it to be on this list, but 50 Shades of Grey is nowhere on this list. It's still a really bad movie, but I feel like Dakota Johnson and some decent visuals here and there kind of saved it from being like the worst of the worst. So that's how I review movies, very objectively, I'd like to think, but it doesn't change the fact that I still think 50 Shades of Grey is probably the most offensive movie I saw in 2015. Oh, and one last thing, if there are some movies that you expect to see in a worst of 2015 list but they're not here, it's either because I just didn't see them or they didn't come out in cinemas here at all, because this list will contain movies released in 2015 in Philippine cinemas. Alright, so before we get to the main list, I have a few dishonorable mentions as always. First of all, we have Vacation, which is this reboot/sequel to the Vacation series that totally just forgets the heart of the franchise, the fact that it's supposed to be about family, and instead it's just filled with unlikable characters, and it just resorts to this offensive, unfunny style of humor that, just is kind of uncomfortable to watch. I still don't understand how people could laugh at the image of a young boy asphyxiating his older brother with a plastic bag. It's just not funny. Next up we have Sinister 2, which is just an incredibly unscary horror sequel that strays away from the great characters and slow-building mystery of the original and instead focuses on these stupid jump scares that do not make any sense whatsoever, and it also has like really bad child actors. Next up is a movie that I actually haven't reviewed yet, but I will soon, hopefully. But yeah, it's definitely one of the worst of the year. It is Point Break. This is a reboot of the 90s cult action movie that is also probably the single worst edited movie of 2015. Just the editing in this movie is mind-bogglingly awful. The writing is just super paper thin, and the actors in this movie legitimately kind of make Keanu Reeves look like Daniel Day-Lewis. And lastly, just missing this list is the movie that I just reviewed, which is Frankenstein vs. the Mummy, and this is just straight to DVD schlock that takes an hour and 40 minutes of dense, pretentious, meaningless dialogue just to get to the titular fight scene that lasts for about 2 minutes long. So this movie is just a colossal waste of time. Okay, but on to the actual list, and at number 5 is a movie that I had such a difficult time talking about because I really didn't consider it an actual film, but it still makes this list. So at number 5 is the PSA and Nations Passion. My review for this is instead entitled How to Review Documentaries, just because I didn't know how to talk about it. And like I've said many times before, this is a film that really doesn't feel like it should have been released in cinemas at all. I mean, it's everything in its production just kind of screams extended commercial. It's really what it comes off as. And it kind of lands at number 5 because I do feel kind of bad for it because it really just doesn't feel like a movie. But that does not change the fact that it is a terrible documentary, from the simplest things like inconsistent video quality, sound, graphics like title cards and whatnot are inconsistent, to having just like this misguided structure or focus on its subject. It doesn't actually look at the PBA in any insightful way, it just ends up putting it up on a pedestal. Interestingly enough, the existence of this movie points more to a flaw with film distribution here in the Philippines and with whoever decides to greenlight these kinds of cinema releases, because I'm sure they knew that nobody was gonna watch this movie, so I don't know why it still came out. But for number 4, let's go to a movie that's actually a movie in a manner of speaking, and that is Taken 3. Majority of people say that Taken 2 is still worse, but at least Taken 2 was still kind of a Taken movie. At least it kinda followed the formula and stuck to the characters, but this movie is just not a Taken movie at all. It's just this convoluted mess of a wannabe mystery film with zero logic whatsoever and terrible action again from Olivier Megaton. And I still can't get over the fact that Forrest Whitaker deduces that Liam Neeson's character is innocent by eating evidence from a crime scene. Every single actor in this movie mails in a really bored and lazy performance. It has some of the worst film editing I've ever seen in a movie, from the weird abrupt tangents to these side characters who don't progress the story in any way whatsoever, to dozens of cuts every time a simple action is being done. Like, Liam Neeson jumping over a fence takes a dozen takes. And I think Taken 3 represents the tendency of some filmmakers to think that sticking to simple things isn't, stepping it up, so they feel the need to complicate things, and it just ends up making things a lot worse. And what's worse is that Olivier Megaton, the director here, just does not have the capability to step things up in an intellectual way for this kind of movie. And, the fact that no one gets taken in this movie already is a bad sign. And I know that most of the movies I've mentioned so far really are kind of like movies you'd expect to be bad, but let's talk about a real disappointment, like a movie that had so much potential and completely dropped the ball, and that is Fant4stic. I think some people expected this movie to be a bit higher on the list, but here this is number 3. And again, I've heard people say that Fant4stic, the first act of Fant4stic is good, but I actually beg to differ, because, while Josh Trank's vision of these characters is kind of noble, he just doesn't have a good enough grasp on tone and character to make us really care about them as we enter, like, the second half. And when this second half hits, it truly becomes one of the worst superhero movies ever made. Like, it's just really, really bad. The acting is super dull. The visual effects feel very unfinished, in fact. Some of the dialogue is just really cringeworthy and just hard to listen to. Doctor Doom, they turned Doctor Doom into one of the worst villains ever in a movie. And the last, I'd say maybe 15 minutes, is this mishmash of just half-hearted action and whatnot that just really feels so barely thrown together that I really feel like a bunch of high school filmmakers could have done the job better. Fant4stic to me serves as an example of the worst that can happen when the Hollywood studio system fails. When a studio has such a bad relationship with the filmmakers that the filmmakers' careers end up being injured, and this kind of stuff just, I don't want it to happen anymore. And like, why is it happen this way? Now, while Fant4stic's failure is kind of a noble failure in some aspects, let's go to a movie that is just a complete sellout in every sense, and it's actually a movie I haven't reviewed yet. Hopefully I will soon, and that is Paranormal Activity: The Ghost Dimension. It's, again, like I said, an absolute sellout that ditches the series' best elements, which are, atmosphere and simplicity. I mean, even if if you've never liked Paranormal Activity, you have to admit that at least at the beginning, it had things going for it that separated itself from other found footage horror films. The fact that they used, little CGI, they just used like little effects of things moving, and the atmosphere they built around those scenes really made them scary. But here, they decide to show us the demon in all his CGI symbiote glory, and like the moment you see Toby, it just completely sucks out all the scariness, because you know what it looks like. It doesn't actually hurt anybody, so you are bored for the entire movie. And what really makes me mad is that they've been marketing this movie as the last in the franchise, hopefully it is, and yet it shows no responsibility for answering any of the questions that the previous movie set up. In fact, it leaves more questions than you had going into it. And it just doesn't end properly. The way it ends is even more abrupt than any of the other movies. At least Taken 3's departure from its effective formula at least kind of seemed like a misguided good intention, but here it really just feels like a shameless attempt for money. The fact that they made a found footage movie in 3D, how does that make any kind of sense? And there's that whole hullabaloo about how they released it in theaters in the States, but then the producers were like, we want to release it on VOD like a few days later, so the theaters were like, why are we going to show it in cinemas anyway? So they just pulled it out. It's just dumb in every sense. And finally, at number 1 is a movie that I found just so bad that I had such an unpleasant time watching it and I just couldn't review it properly again, and that of course is Taken. This movie had one job, just to spoof Taken. That's it. Like, that should have been so easy, even if it ended up being bad, but it never actually goes around to spoofing Taken in any meaningful way. It's no better than Meet the Spartans or any of those other spoofs, but it's not clever at all in its references to Taken. It's not funny, even in the dumb way. Like, the jokes just really kind of fall flat. Taken has an obvious lack of budget, but the actors as well have a total lack of talent. And nobody in production seems to know what they're doing. You know, there's literally no plot in this movie. There's no structure to the jokes. It just feels like a bunch of rejected SNL skits barely strung together. There's no direction, and it's honestly kind of offensive from time to time. Like, it just stoops down to the lowest of the low. Taken really makes me wonder why we even get these kinds of movies in our cinemas. I mean, it really makes me feel bad for those struggling filmmakers who would kind of kill for even just a straight to DVD release, and yet, you know, even if they're willing to put in the effort and stuff, they're just not noticed, and instead we get trash like this that people clearly didn't put any effort into. Alright, so those are my 5 worst movies of 2015. I'm sweating like crazy. I'm done talking about these movies. I will say though that the terrible movies this year actually weren't as bad as the ones last year. But the real winner of worst of the year in terms of cinema in 2015 is the Metro Manila Film Festival. That's another video for another time, but you know, the way this festival has been managed so far, especially this year, you know, has really kind of stirred the pot and has made a lot of people angry. And honestly, this festival deserves all that anger because it's just ridiculous at this point. So here's to change in 2016. Hopefully we won't have as many terrible movies in 2016. But what did you guys think of all these movies? Do you have your own picks for worst of 2015? Tell me below and let's have a conversation.